The best thing about 90s fantasy is that it's inspired by 80s fantasy. Not just that it's inspired by 80s fantasy, but that it's uninfluenced by early 2000s fantasy. So much early fantasy was inspired by and influenced by Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings. And I feel like there was a time when fantasy wanted to break away from being so Tolkien-esque and be its own thing. And in some ways that meant it's gonna be really weird. Which is fine. Let it be weird. It's fantasy. But then you had the Lord of the Rings movies, the Peter Jackson version, and then a whole new resurgence of Lord of the Rings inspired fantasy again. I recently finished the Black Trillium. This came out in 1990. So it was kind of in that sweet spot between trying to break away from Tolkien in the first place before the resurgence from the movies. Some of the biggest 80s fantasy influences that I see shining through this are actually from 80s fantasy movies, like The Dark Crystal, The Neverending Story, Labyrinth, The Black Cauldron, Willow, The Princess Bride. There's a lot of good popular 80s fantasy. I can definitely see some of those influences here. I read this first as a teenager, so I read it in the early 2000s. I enjoyed it at the time. It wasn't quite as good as I remembered on a reread, but that's okay. It has some of your normal fantasy tropes. You have the invading army with the evil sorcerer who comes in, takes over, the parents die, obviously, and not just one, but 3 princesses have to set out on a quest. 3 quests, 3 journeys, kind of like getting 3 different versions of the same story. There's 3 authors, and each author got one of the princesses' point of views. I feel like the story probably would have been better following one well-rounded princess rather than 3 kind of stereotyped princesses. But part of the point and part of the resolution of the story is that those 3 princesses have to overcome their weaknesses and come together at the end to defeat evil and win. So I can see why it was split into 3 different people rather than one person. But it got a little old towards the end when all 3 have to do the same thing. They have to hunt down a magical talisman that they're going to bring back and combine at the end. And because it wasn't terribly long to have those 3 different point of views, neither one of the 3 princesses got to go super deep into their struggle and what they had to overcome by the end. It wasn't a super character-driven story. I felt like it was a lot more about the world. Because it was trying to break away from the Tolkien-esque fantasy, it was trying to show how weird it was. It's set on, I believe, a different planet in the land of Ruenda. The main characters are all human, but the humans are not native to this land. The natives are called oddlings. They remind me a lot of the puppet creatures from the Dark Crystal. I feel like that was the main influence on them. At least, I kept picturing the oddlings like the gelflings. The oddlings are native to the land. There's different races of oddlings. Some of them work more closely with the humans, some of them are more wild, but they all come together at the end to help the princesses win back their kingdom from the evil guys who invaded. Something else that I think stands out about the time that this was written is that it has a super soft magic system. It was written in a time before Sanderson's laws. Which I think is going to be super influential on fantasy going forward. Really hard magic systems with rules that the reader understands really well. This one does not have that. This one, the magic is mysterious. Nobody really knows how it works. Not the reader, not the characters in the story. It's magical. They get their talismans and they can suddenly do magic. It's so non-rule based that if it were to go deeper into how they do their magic, it could get very overpowered very quickly, which is part of the reason for rules for your magic system. For a book like this, I think it was okay for it to be super soft. The country they live in, that the oddlings are native to, is super swampy. It's like one big continent of swamp and marshland. They travel by boat. I believe it is supposed to be post-apocalyptic. It doesn't really get into it in this book. This is the first of a series. I believe humans come from a different world, and then they get here, they build up kind of far technologically, and then whatever the cataclysm was takes them back to more medieval times. And so you have the vanished ones who have left technology in the ruins, in hidden places in the swamps, and the evil sorcerer wants those items. He thinks they're magic. He wants to gather them all and try to take over the world. But Rwenda has the kindly old woman sorceress who protects the land. Her magic has been weakening, so now the evil guy can come in and try to take over. As part of trying to take over, the evil sorcerer, Orogastis, I don't know, but I'm gonna say Orogastis, he tries to seduce one of the princesses. These princesses are only 17, quite young, pretty average for a fantasy story, I guess. But luckily, she is smart enough not to fall for it. She sees right through him. Had a very nice resolution. Only the bad guys die at the end. The kind prince gets engaged to one of the princesses. Everything just ends all peachy, happily ever after. I think I'm gonna try to read some more 90s fantasy coming up in the next year. If you have any really good suggestions, let me know. Or if you feel like there's any 90s fantasy that should be avoided, let me know that too. Happy reading!